A very good morning to you this Sunday morning, and I'm hoping you're well, and also hoping that you are continuing to pray for our nation. Won't you please turn with me to Matthew chapter 8? Matthew chapter 8, and we're going to look from verse 14 onwards. Almost every day in our nation and across the world, we hear of the most dreadful murders, rapes, vehicle accidents, inhumane brutality between peoples and nations, natural disasters on top of all of that. Now, when we hear of such things, we increasingly tend to ask questions such as, why does God allow this to happen? Why didn't God prevent this from happening? Now, as I hear questions like that, I get the impression that sometimes, if not a great deal of the time, these sorts of questions are actually apportioning blame to God. We're actually holding God directly responsible for these evils, and the dreadful conclusion is, well, so much for your God of love that he allows such things to happen. The truth of the matter, however, is that God is not the author of evil. Rather, the calamities which befall us as human beings have another source altogether. Since the fall of man, this earth has been a hostile environment to human beings. And this hostile environment is, at the present time, under Satan's control. In John chapter 12 and verse 31, Jesus calls Satan the prince of this world. That is, the one who exercises authority over this realm of existence. Thus, and ultimately, he is the author of all the evil and suffering which is our common experience. Having said that, however, we need to add immediately that Satan's control of this planet is a limited control, and much, much more, it is a temporary control. When Jesus Christ stepped into human history, he began a work which will be completed at his glorious return of taking back for God this planet. This morning, then, I want us to recognize how Jesus' actions reveal God's authority on earth. Christ's actions while upon this earth reveal God's ultimate authority on the earth. That is, God's rightful control over this part of his creation, all of which will come to completion at Christ's return in glory. And there are four specific areas where God's authority was and is revealed by Jesus' actions. Firstly, Christ exercised authority over disease. Christ exercised authority over all disease that was presented to him. In verse 14 of Matthew chapter 8, we read, "When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him." Each winter, as many of us this very winter already know, flu seems to make an unwelcome visit to us. Normally, though, the flu virus is relatively harmless. Provided we stay in bed for a few days, we suffer not much more than head and body aches. In 1918, however, it was different. A particularly virulent strain of flu made its way across the world and killed millions of people. The estimates are between 17 million and 50 million, even up to 100 million people killed by the flu. There were more people killed by that epidemic, it seems, than died in the whole of World War I. The flu virus, as we well know, is just one of thousands and thousands which cause sickness and disease in human beings. The virus which is best known in our day and age is the COVID virus, making its appearance seemingly out of nowhere, but definitely out of Wuhan, China. At the end of 2019, the COVID virus has infected 587 million people throughout the world, and it has killed 6.5 million people across the world. And still there is no ultimate cure on the horizon. Disease, it seems, is the human condition. And I once heard a definition of good health which seems to substantiate that statement. Good health is when our bodies are functioning at optimum levels to ward off disease and death. Just say that again. Good health is when our bodies are functioning at optimum levels to ward off disease and death. The best our bodies can do is to ward disease off, but our bodies can't do it indefinitely. Eventually, all of us must succumb to disease and certainly to death. When Jesus Christ began to minister on earth, however, he destroyed disease in people's bodies. He put it to flight. In the case of Peter's mother-in-law, he touched her, and the fever which had her in its grip immediately left her body. In the case of the two blind men sitting just outside the city of Jericho, Jesus touched their blind and useless eyes, and immediately in rushed the light and color and form and movement. Matthew 20:29 tells us about that. In the case of the paralyzed man who was lowered through the roof to be in front of Jesus, Jesus said, "Get up, take your mat, and go home." Immediately, previously useless limbs were energized and strengthened, and we read in Mark chapter 2 from verse 12 that the lame man, walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." Indeed, they hadn't, for God had never walked this earth before, destroying disease. Disease, as one of the results of the fall and as one of the enemies of mankind, was put to flight. It was routed as Jesus reinstituted God's original plan for mankind, which was perfect health. But, and please hear me in this, it only happened for those in that time whom Jesus personally healed. Not everybody in Palestine was healed at that time. Satan's grip, though, was loosened as Jesus took control. Secondly, Jesus also exercised authority over death. And if you turn over to Matthew chapter 9 and read from verse 18, it says this. It says, while Jesus was saying this, a ruler came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did the disciples. And then to verse 23, when Jesus entered the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd, he said, "Go away, the girl is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. And after the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hands, and she got up. And news of this spread through all the region. The end of disease is death. And I was unfortunate enough once upon a time to witness that fact. For some reason or another, I had to go down to a mortuary. And as I walked through the swing doors, there were two bodies wrapped in white linen cloths, lying on hospital trolleys and about to be placed in refrigerated cabinets. And as I spoke to the mortuary attendant, my nostrils were filled with the stench of disinfectant and death, for death has a very unique smell. And as I walked away, I was overtaken by a cold, sick fear, which I recognized as the dread of death. For hours I went through varying degrees of dread until I spent some time in prayer. And in prayer I reminded myself that Jesus Christ has said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, but behold, I am alive forever and ever." And then I asked the living one to take away my dread of death. And sure enough, the dread slipped away like a shadow chased by the light. And since then, I've been reminded of a truth concerning my experience of dread. In Hebrews 2:14, we are told that Jesus, too, shared in our humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Jesus Christ, through his life and death and resurrection, has conquered the devil, thereby destroying his power of death. And Jesus has made it possible for us to be set free from our fear of death. Christ's actions then have reversed the most horrific and most enduring effect of the fall, the power of death. And in raising people from the dead, and in himself being raised from the dead, he has taken control already of our last enemy. Thus he announces triumphantly, "I hold the keys of death and hell." But the full scope of that triumph awaits his return. Until then, death continues to be, as it were, our last enemy, albeit an already defeated one. Thirdly, Christ also exercised authority over demons. If you go to Matthew chapter 8, from verse 28, it reads as follows: "When he," that is Jesus, "arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. 'What do you want with us, Son of God?' they shouted. 'Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?' Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, 'If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs.' And Jesus said to them, 'Go.' So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off into the town and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave the region." Now, what an extraordinary reaction by those people. And the only way in which I can explain that is the fact that these people realized, hang on a second now, here we are faced with someone who has power over those things that we do not have any power over. Demons. Because in that day, as in our day and in very many cultures, demons and demon possession was a common phenomenon, and there was no way out of it. And yet, here was a man who had cast them out, giving evidence of his power over them, terrifying evidence in the eyes of these people.